Where to begin? I just rewatched Dune. Is this an official review of the film? Or am I just going to ramble into it? Starting... Boy, where to begin? The newest one, Dune, was released in 2021 and directed by Denis Villeneuve, legendary filmmaker who gave us Blade Runner 2049, and stars a whole host of people. I'll name as many as I can. Timothée Chalamet, Rebecca Ferguson, Josh Brolin, Oscar Isaac, Stellan Skarsgård, Dave Bautista, Charlotte Rampling, what's his name? Jason Momoa at some point, and many, many other actors. I can't name all of them, but it's a lot of characters in this film. And it's an adaptation of Frank Herbert's series of novels. Novels which I have never read. I probably won't read at this point, and they are famous for being unadaptable. You know, they're one of that particular type of films. So I knew nothing about this film going in first time. I'd heard about it. I'd never seen the David Lynch version. I never read the books, never saw the miniseries, none of that shit. I went in completely blind. I went in as blind as possible, not knowing a single thing about it, and I wanted to know nothing about it because I wanted to experience it fresh. Now at the time, I was still very much burned out on Star Wars. And it's still ruined for me. It's still not going to come back. I'm done with Star Wars. I'm having to move on. I need to find something new. And in the years since then, I switched over to Blade Runner, something that's science fiction and high concept, but a bit more made for grown-ups. It's an adult series. Dune, despite its PG-13 rating, or 12 over here, is very much a series geared towards adult. It's not science fiction for the whole family. It is certainly accessible to a wide audience base, but it's not as accessible as, say, Star Wars, which was explicitly made for kids that just happens to be accessible to an older audience. This has been described as Interstellar, Game of Thrones, so to speak. You have lots of factions, you have lots of moving parts, multiple families. You have a kind of colonial era series of systems with an imperium, as it's called. You have an emperor at the top of it. You have his royal guard. You have systems within that, within each of the respective houses, and you have kind of a medieval or 18th century style structure within each of them. You know, you all have dukes, you have bloodlines, you have set up marriages, all of that good stuff. That was the impression I got from the very first time I watched it, and it was fairly easy to follow. The most immediate thing you notice about Dune is that it's basically Avatar, and I remember thinking at the time, okay, all right, this is basically you have the colonizers that reap the benefits of this one planet that has all of the resources, and you have the natives that we don't understand, and then we go there to drain the resources, and then this one guy gets separated from his group, and he has to learn the ways of the natives, but then they don't like it because he kind of betrays them. Doesn't quite have the liar reveal that Avatar goes for, and in many ways Avatar is probably a rip-off of this, because the books came long before James Cameron had the idea for it. So I knew all of that going in the first time. Having said that, hindsight really is a blessing in disguise, because even though that may have kind of bothered me at first, this was undoubtedly one of the best experiences I've had with this film. Even though I saw it in IMAX, double tapped it when it first came out, I was planning on triple tapping. It didn't initially click with me for these reasons, but because I was actually able to experience it almost fresh this time, I was able to get good perspective on the whole thing, and not just because I can see the frame more clearly. Yes, some bits of dialogue are a little unclear. I can't quite hear everything. It does also help that the second part has come out and I'm able to watch that. And no, I'm not going to put in Dune 2 just yet. That's another 2.5 hours I don't have. But even without that, it does help. I am able to appreciate the fact that this movie, despite being a part one, is also very much a completed story arc in its own right. I would argue it's still... it is still a bit of an issue whereby towards the latter half or the second hour that we go before we close out, it is a little unclear when it's going to end and when it's going to keep going, because the action that we have, the epic scenes, they do tend to be a lot of them, and they're all kind of shot in the same way. The sound of the score is very much the same, and you don't quite know when it is they're going to end. So first, between the Emperor and the Harkonnens attacking House Atreides and blowing up all of their ships, and then Lady Jessica and Paul getting captured and crashing into the desert, and then they get picked up by Duncan, and then they go into a secret hideaway where they kind of go through some more plans and rendezvous with one of their other allies, and then they have to get into an ornithopter, and then they have to fly all the way out there, and then they have to go to find the Fremen. All of this takes place over the course of 1 hour, and I wasn't entirely sure when it was going to end, and it was rather tricky at the time when I was watching it. To the point where when they do all walk off, not into the sunset, but the sunrise, and they're both looking at those sandworms being ridden all the way over there as like a teaser for the next film, I was okay, I know I've seen this movie 5 times, but it is still a little bit, oh good, finally it's the end of this film. What do I admire most about it? I guess I admire the scope of it. I do miss the IMAX bars. The Blu-ray does not contain that, which is a downside. I don't know if you get them on streaming. I don't recommend you stream this film. Watch it in a theatre or on physical media like I did. But there is still an epic sense of scale to it. The visual effects are virtually seamless. You can tell some parts are computer generated, and you can tell which parts are models. What's great is that I can actually make out the scale this time. You know, I doesn't just see one big thing on the screen and then, oh, what are those little dots there? Oh, those are meant to be people. You really can sense the scale of this thing a lot better. But it helps that I know what's happening, so I don't have to focus as much on the frame. This has always occurred to me every time I've viewed it, is that the fight scenes don't always feel as exciting as I feel they could have. They're not shot the way that a John Wick fight scene would do, and I get that. That's the way that Denis likes to shoot things. They're very, very clean, very straightforward. There isn't a lot of flashy camera moves. He mostly lets the performers do their thing, but it does feel at times a little bit like the choreography is doing the heavy lifting, and they don't feel as dangerous. And it isn't just because of the lack of blood. I mean, there's certainly a lack of blood, and this is one of the ways where PG-13 can show its downsides, because it doesn't feel as though there's any danger. And even though a number of characters die, both important and unimportant, they do often feel like generic red shirt deaths. It doesn't feel as though there's any significance to all of the numbers going. But I did notice a little bit more blood on the characters in a few other scenes. That might just have been a byproduct of the fact that I was watching it on my projector, and that definitely added some weight to it. But there are some moments where it still felt like, okay, I'm not entirely sure what happened. It's also a question of geography, because I don't know what Arrakis looks like. It just looks like desert to me. And so when there's the big battle for the city, and you have ornithopters flying all over and craft over here, it's so dark that I can't tell what's happening, and I can't tell which side of the map each of the characters are on, and where the danger is coming from, where they're running towards, what they're running away from. I don't know the layout very well. It all looks very similar. I don't know if that was an issue with Denis or the director of photography, or maybe it's just a byproduct of the fact they're making the film this way. Because you compare it to 2049, which is very colourful. The final battle in that, which takes place over the ocean, the geography couldn't be clearer, but it's only between 3 ships, and then it turns into a fight scene which does feel more dangerous, and not just because there is blood that's able to show, and it feels more violent. This feels a little bit more staged, but you could argue because they're soldiers who are meant to follow a sort of strict code. One thing I love about Dune is the lore. Now that's, again, mostly due to the source material, but I love the fact that I'm watching a film that has its own backstory. It did take a while to get used to it, and the first few times it wasn't entirely clear, but I definitely respected that it wasn't spoon-feeding the audience. On that note, I felt that the exposition this time around was just a little bit, I don't want to say hammy, but a bit more obvious. I know that you need to explain brand new things to audience members who may not have seen anything and know nothing about this story going in, like me, but there were a few moments where Paul would say, oh, we have to walk the way that the Fremen do, otherwise we're dead. Yeah, because we've already seen him learn from those tapes before he even got to Arrakis, and then when he got to Arrakis. But we're to assume Lady Jessica has also read about Arrakis and knows what to do, so it just felt a bit like he's just telling something to the audience. Downsides. Fuck it, I have to call her out. I don't buy Zendaya as an actor. I never have. I've never watched Euphoria, so it's not really fair. I can't comment on that. But between these 2 films that I've seen her in, I don't think she's very convincing. I think she's a pop star who, well, I guess she started as a Disney girl, but still, I don't buy her, and I don't think she and Timothée Chalamet have great chemistry, even in the second film. I think she has decent chemistry in the stills where you see her in dreams, but it's not really a spoiler for Dune 2 if you've never seen that, but the fact that she feels like a different character in those premonitions that we see her in this film compared to the character that we later meet in that film. Obviously, I'll review Dune 2 at some other point. Preferably as like another retrospective. It helps that it's a film that I know very well because I saw it twice in theatres. The other one I only saw once. As for which one I prefer, hard to say. Maybe I'll do a comparison once I've reviewed the second part as well. Because I think this is a rare example of you can have them both individually and as one. It's not quite like the Blade Runners, where they are definitely individual films and one can function on its own, but also as a sequel to the other. This is clearly one story that's told in 2 parts. They just split it in half. This is easily one of the best part 1, part 2s, possibly the best. It's definitely better than Harry Potter, and it is better than Hunger Games. And I'm in the minority of quite liking the Hunger Games series. Anyway, conclusion. Is it worth buying on Blu-ray? Absolutely. Is it worth a 4K? If you can, I'd say go for it. Just bear in mind, only only part 1 comes with a 4K and a 1080 disc. Part 2 is either 1080 or 4K, so you can't do both. If you wish to do part 2 in 4K, go for it. I don't, because I have a projector that is only 1080. I don't have a 4K projector, only 4K TV. And I plan on sticking with the projector for a while, so I don't mind sacrificing a bit of image quality for the sake of having a bit more versatility with the disc. The bonus features are exactly the same. The casing is very similar. You would only get 2 discs if you bought an ultra limited edition, and I can't justify that because it doesn't mean as much to me. You may differ. This is a great adaptation based on what I've heard about the books. I don't know if I'm going to read them. I'd be excited to see if Denis makes another one. But, as he commented, it's 6 years of his life, and I wouldn't put it past him if he didn't want to work on any more. Honestly, the 2 parts that we've got are great. I also appreciated that we spent a bit more time on Caladan this time. Initially, I was like, oh, could we just get to Arrakis? I spent the first opening minute on Arrakis with Zendaya, and I want to get to see a bit more. I was able to appreciate the fact that we were setting up the chess pieces a bit more this time. It took its time. It took a full 30 minutes before we were on Arrakis, but 2.5 hour movie, this is nothing. Yes, pacing isn't bad. I think the structure is the problem, particularly in the latter 90 minutes. I'd say that's the real difficulty. Favourite piece of Hans Zimmer, Leaving Caladan, definitely. But my second favourite, very close, would actually be the Bene Gesserit soundtrack. I'm a sucker for anything with choral arrangements, the whispering, that was all great. I love the scene with Lady Jessica as they approach. She looks terrified, sitting there in the rain with it's quite possibly my favourite shot in the whole film. I also really appreciated Charlotte Rampling. I didn't really care for her the first few times I watched it, but this is definitely the most impressed I've been with her in this. And I love the fact that it took me a while to guess who she was the first time, because even though it's a very thin veil, she is wearing one. And like, who's that? I recognise her. Oh, shit! Easily the best that we've seen her, although she's also great in the next one. Star rating, 4 stars, easy, no problem. 4.2, I'd say, that's my thing. Very few films, for context, have been given a full 5. I should explain my star grading system. So I don't just give a film 5 or so stars. I have to break it up in order to explain the nuances between certain individual films. So what I do is I break it up in decimal points, and we go with that particular ruling. When rounding up a decimal, anything 0.4 or below gets rounded down, anything 0.5 or above gets rounded up, meaning any film that is a 5-star film could just be a 4.5. It would just get graded up, because that's my way of accepting that even a perfect film is not perfect. It's still got some flaws. Or perhaps 3.5 is like, okay, I'll give it a 4, but it barely makes it. It's like a passing grade. Dune, 4.2. Excellent film. Definitely worth buying on Blu-ray. I'm so glad I saw it in the theatres. If there is a re-release for this film in cinemas, see it on the biggest screen possible. Despite the fact that they didn't shoot it with IMAX cameras, still go for it. Go for the biggest screen with the loudest speakers. The same is true for the Blade Runners as well. Is that everything? It only took me 15 minutes, but I managed to go at it without stopping. Let's hope I don't have to cut this too much.